show of hands, really quickly, who in this room has worked a bit with Angular? Who feels like they really know Angular really well? Who's written custom directives? All right, for those of you who've written custom directives, I'm sorry, you might find this a little bit boring, elementary. But I want to talk about directives, which to me are the most powerful part of AngularJS. I call them the next 42, and this is a bit of a geek reference to Scott Adams' Life, the Universe, and Everything. 42 is the ultimate answer, to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. And that's, for me, that's what directives were to AngularJS. Before we get started, if you want to follow along these slides, you can go ahead and pull them open on your browser. Benjamin, so bnjm.in/the next42. And then at the end, I'd appreciate you leaving me feedback on joined in. You can just add -feedback to that URL, and that will redirect you to the joined in link for this talk. Okay, before we get going, who am I? My name is Ben Loveridge. I started hacking on HTML and JavaScript when I was about 13, and my 8th grade teacher gave me the chance to either learn earth science or make him a website. Not a tough decision for a 13-year-old who likes tinkering with computers. So to this day, I can't tell you all the layers of the crust of the earth in the right order, but I can do HTML and JavaScript. You can find me on GitHub with Loveridge. That's what I try and use everywhere that I can. Unfortunately, there are other people in the world whose name starts with a B who happen to be a Loveridge, so I can't get that on Twitter. So I resort to Terminon there. If I can't be Loveridge, I'm usually Terminon. I work at a small startup called GradeCam. It's based out of California, but the development team is all here in Utah, except for the CEO, who is a developer. And I'm also the primary maintainer of the Jasmine Reporters repository on GitHub. So if you've ever used Jasmine to test any of your JavaScript projects, and you've ever brought in an XML reporter, that probably came from Jasmine Reporters. So I've been involved with that for about 5 years now. All right, so what are our goals here? I want to talk about what are directives. I want to talk about why, for me, they were the biggest part of AngularJS. When should you use a directive? How do you write a directive? What are the options to write a directive? And more importantly, perhaps, how do you test a directive? Because that's one of the great things about directives is how encapsulated they are, how easy they are to test. So I want to make sure that when we leave here, we know how to test it. In fact, I'd like to write some tests here. The goal is that at the end of this course, we will write a directive, and we will test that directive all before we leave here. So I'm trying to keep the last hour of your Friday interesting. This is a crash course, like I said, so if you've already got some experience with directives, hopefully we can still keep you interested a little bit. A few years ago, when we started working on the refactor, or the rewrite rather, of our flagship product at GradeCam, this question always came up when we were evaluating frameworks. Or whenever you talk to any web developer who's been doing this for a while, they say, well, hey, have you looked at AngularJS? The search trends for Angular have been growing steadily. I mean, we start over here in January of 2013, and now in May, it continues to grow month over month. Lots of other web frameworks still have lots of popularity, and they maintain that, and that's great. Angular just keeps getting more and more traction. So yeah, I'd heard of Angular. I'd heard of what it could do, but I hadn't actually looked at it. When I did look at it, this is what I found. I found lots of stuff that they talk about, it's a model view whatever. Yay, so I can structure my data however I want to. They talk about injectors. Great, I can find ways to get the services that I want to use myself. They talk about factories. Great, I know how to write a factory. So my reaction to all of this was kind of just, okay, what else? Because lots of things can do either this for me or give me the tools to build this without too much difficulty. And so it just didn't get me very excited. And then I found directives. And I kind of had a Wall-E moment. And so if you were at my coworker's talk earlier this morning, yeah, this has been an ongoing joke around the office as we've prepared for these talks. But if you've seen the movie Wall-E, when Eve first comes down and she's trying to find the plant, she goes around, she gets really frustrated, she blows things up. And then she finds Wall-E. She doesn't know what language he speaks. She comes over, and when she finally decides to start talking to him instead of trying to kill him, she starts asking him in a bunch of different languages, directive, what's your directive? And he He doesn't speak those languages, so it's just not computing for him. Then finally she asks in English, directive, and he gets it. Ah, directive. She wants to know what my job is. She wants to know what I'm doing. And it just clicked for him, and they were able to connect. They were able to communicate and make something happen. And that was the moment when I really started to understand directives, because that's what happened to me. Is I saw directives, and I was kind of like, okay, so what can I do with these? It's a class, it's an element, it's an attribute, okay. But then it really started to click for me. And that's when I started to kind of believe in the title attribute of the AngularJS.org website. If you look at the title bar, it says AngularJS, the super heroic model view whatever framework. I finally started to feel like, okay, maybe Angular is kind of a superhero. Maybe it's making me and my code into a superhero, I don't know. But I really started to catch the vision and catch how Angular could make my life easier. And then I realized, if you take away directives from AngularJS, you're not left with very much. Because as I've said, all those other components, other frameworks offer, but even more than that, without directives, Angular doesn't work. Take 20 or 30 seconds and look at the code here and see if you can find the directives. I'm pretty sure you'll spot some of them. Here's three that probably most of you found: ng app, ng controller, and ng model. What these are saying, the first one is saying, hey, the HTML DOM element is going to be the container for my application. That's what the ng app says. Ng controller says, hey, I need some controller that has business logic, that knows how to do things. We're going to call that form control, and we're also going to attach that to the HTML tag. Then we've got an input field with an ng model of your age. What that means is there's some attribute, there's some value provided by form control to the scope called your age, and whatever that is, we want that to go into the input box. Maybe it starts out empty, maybe it has a value. Whenever we change that value in our input, we want to update that value. But there are some others here that maybe you didn't see. Hopefully you did. The script tag is actually a directive. The input tag is also a directive. Without, pattern. You probably thought that pattern was just the HTML5 attribute, which works great without Angular in modern browsers to a certain extent. But Angular takes that and turns it into a directive, and also the required attribute. And why does Angular need all these things? Why do we have all these directives? Well, like I said, Angular doesn't really work without these directives. That's how we get input binding. That's what ng model does, is it binds to that input. That's how we get the bootstrapping of our application. We say, I want it to be here. Now, yeah, you can do that programmatically. But if you don't want to do it programmatically, if you're just doing a simple app inside of your page, or maybe even a couple different apps for different components of your web page. Form validation, that's what the pattern attribute and the required attribute do. You tie those onto your input field, which are part of some form, which incidentally form is also a directive. And that says, oh, well, if this pattern is not being matched, I'm going to say that this input field is not valid. If you try and submit the form, we're going to reject. We'll give you error messages so you can display what's going on, but we're going to reject you out of hand because our form validation directives have said, sorry, you can't go here. So what do directives actually do for us, though? Let's look at a couple small code samples. Here's a pretty simple JavaScript function which you might have written something similar to this in the past in any number of web apps. We have some array of books, and for each book in that array, we're just going to use jQuery to quickly create a div, add the title and the author of that book. So we're going to have something like A Christmas Carol, comma, by Charles Dickens. And we attach that to the body. We can do the same thing in Angular. We have this ng controller, main control. We have our books living inside that controller. And we're saying, do a repeat on all of those books. Book in main.books says loop over main.books, and the variable that I want to reference those as in my template is book. And then we say, inside that div, we have book.title, comma, book.author. So these two pieces of code accomplish the exact same thing. They both attach a list to the body of your books. Let's look at another one. I've got a div. Whenever they click on this div, I want to tell my controller to do something, and then I want to prevent this event from getting to anybody else. I don't want upstream elements to be able to handle this. Pretty straightforward. we can do the same thing in Angular. We can say ng-click, call main controller.handleClick, and stop the propagation on that event. We've accomplished the same thing without any JavaScript. And what's even better about this is that our JavaScript, our controller, doesn't need to know or care about the DOM, which if you get active in Angular at all, you'll quickly learn that one of the most common and misunderstood, most commonly misused anti-patterns is to have your controllers interact with the DOM. That shouldn't happen. Controllers should be logic. If you want to do something in the DOM, try and keep it in the DOM, or try and put it into a directive. Directives are meant to interact with the DOM. Controllers are meant to interact with data and do logic. So really, directives are functions that you can express or write into your HTML. Matthias Niemala he's one of the core AngularJS developers. He's currently working on Angular 2. And that's the way he describes them. And that really, I think, is a very succinct way of describing what is a directive. What's it do? It's a function. It's a function that you can define. Now, what kind of directives are there? Sometimes I feel like trying to code is like going to war. I feel like it's all out, me against the machine. Sometimes I win. Usually I try to win. I always try to win. Usually I do win. Sometimes I don't. MACE is just a simple acronym I've come up with to help myself remember what are the types of directives and how do we reference them in Angular. There are comment directives, there are attribute directives, there are class directives and element directives. They all look a little bit different, but they all look a little bit the same too. And they can many times do the same thing, regardless of which you choose. It kind of depends on the task that you want to accomplish. So let's look at an example of each of these. Comment directives. The comment directives do have a little bit of a special syntax because comments generally are meaningless in code to compilers. So we say directive outline. That's the name of the directive that we've written, and any arguments, any values that we put in after the name of the directive are going to be passed in as a single argument. So I'm giving this directive the argument of blue. Now we can try hovering over and clicking each word. When I hover over them, hey, guess what? I'm actually using a different comment directive for each of these words, for each of these spans. It's not showing up over there? That's really unfortunate. Let's see if I can do it over here. Okay, there we go. So as I hover over these, we can see that it's doing what we expect it to. This one's hovering, it's doing an outline in orange. If I click it, it'll stay there. So usually your comments are going to be minified out at build time. Hopefully they are, because otherwise we're just sending a bunch of extra meaningless bits over the wire. So that's one of the reasons that comment directives are often just not used. But you can use a trick like this to help yourself in development. Say you've got an element that you're going to be animating across the screen, and you want to be able to see how its bounding box might change as it does that. You could throw something silly like this on there, give it an outline, and watch that progression. So they do have some uses, but generally they're not used. They're pretty frowned upon. They're just not nearly as useful, and like I said, they're going to be removed at compile time or at build time most often, so you're probably going to find yourself not using them very often. Now, what about an attribute directive? We've got this X autofocus. X dash, the X dash prefix doesn't really matter. Angular allows you to prefix your attributes with X dash or data dash. The reason that I did that here is because autofocus is actually an HTML5 supported thing. And I didn't want the fact that Chrome supports that to interfere with the demo, so I prefixed it with X dash. Chrome no longer recognizes this as a directive, but what I've said is, on this second input field, when confirm is equal to yes, I want you to give focus. So let's try it. I type in yes. Oh, that didn't work. Let's try it in capitals. It worked. My focus moved over into that next field. You can use something like this when you're trying to help a user progress through a form or any number of other things. So and it also acts as a polyfill for the autofocus behavior. If you run this on, say, IE8, which doesn't support autofocus, well, you've now taught IE8 how to support autofocus. So you can use them as polyfills. Next, a class directive. Say you've got an element that you want to fill the rest of whatever container it's in. I've got some spans. They're all in line. this one in the middle, I want it to grow and shrink based on its neighbor's content, which might grow and change over time. If I resize my browser, which I can't really do because it's inside of an iframe right here, but if I resize my browser, that middle column is going to reflow with that because it has the available width directive telling it to do that. Another common way of using class directives is, say you're using a UI class framework like Foundation or Bootstrap. They have lots of classes that they use to denote different kinds of elements and different types of components. Maybe you want to make it so that all of your drop downs are shorter and scroll. You can make a class directive that ties into that. Whenever it sees that Bootstrap class, it will do whatever your special custom behavior is on that, while not taking away anything that you're getting from the Foundation or Bootstrap in the first place. Lastly, oh, web page is unavailable. That's not good. I think I clicked a link. All right. I've made a simple carousel here. It's just an opacity transition that it's doing here. But I've defined a custom element called carousel. I've given it the list of images that I want it to use. I could pass in other attributes here. In fact, if you go and look at the code here on Plunker, you'll see that it supports a delay. I can pass in delay equals 100, and every 100 milliseconds, it's going to transition those photos for me. So you can make them customizable. You can make them very reusable that way. And we've now made ourselves essentially a custom component. Oh yeah, web components. They're really cool. They're the future of the web. Things are moving towards web components, but the browser support is not there right now. Lots of browsers are behind the times. I'm not going to mention any names, i.e. But with Angular, you can kind of polyfill to an extent, not full support for web components, but you can start writing some of those kinds of things yourself. You can write yourself a date picker if you want to. You can write yourself a carousel and encapsulate all that logic into one place. Sure, you're not getting the benefits of the shadow DOM and everything else that you can get from a true web component, but you can get something that works similar enough for all the platforms that you actually care to target right now. So here's what it might look like. You've got a directive called date picker. This restrict attribute, this tells Angular what kind of component or what kind of directive is this allowed to be. We're saying this one can be anything. I could have a comment called date picker if I wanted to, and it would work. Replace true or false. This really comes into play with element directives like our carousel from before. When you define your template, you're going to when you define your directive, often you're going to have a template. This is, what DOM do I actually render when they put in this custom element? Because my browser doesn't know what a carousel is. My browser doesn't know what a date picker is. So I have to express that in something that my browser can understand. That's what these divs are. If you say replace true, that's going to take your outer element, your carousel tag, and it's going to swap that out and just leave you with the divs. You're not going to have in your rendered DOM a carousel tag anywhere. If you say replace false, which is the default, it'll leave your carousel tag, and then inside of that, you'll have your divs, your images, whatever else happens to be there. Scope. True, false, or an object. By default, you're not going to get a new scope in your directive. Default is false. This is telling Angular, I don't need you to make a new object for me to store my variables in. I'm not actually going to store any. Or true says, yeah, I need to have my own scope, but I don't need to be isolated from my parent. I might even want access to them, but I need to be able to store my own variables in the scope for my template without mucking with somebody's outside scope. I don't want to add elements or attributes to my parent scope. Object. You can pass in a curly brace, just an object with individual named attributes that you care about, and that will create an isolated scope that defines those attributes, that doesn't have access to its parent scope, that doesn't inherit from its parent scope. So you can't say parent.x or parent.foo and have that come from main controller. You've been isolated from that. And then the linking function is where you really do the awesome things. You'll notice this does not have a $sign in front of it. That's because linking functions in directives don't use dependency injection. They just have ordered parameters. You get the scope, which is either going to be your parent scope or your new scope, your isolated scope, whatever that happens to be. The element that the directive is attached to, any attributes on that element, whether they're part of your directive or not. And you can also, we won't go into this one because we're just not going to have time, but you can make directives that only work if certain other directives are present. So you can say, I require an ng model to be present. This would be a common thing if you're making a custom validation for an input field, for example. The fourth attribute here would be any controllers exposed by those other directives that you said you require. So you could interact with the ng model at that case, at that point. But watch out. When you actually try and reference your directive in the DOM, there's a little bit of name mangling that goes on. The Angular wants you to express your name date picker. But when you actually go to use that in your templates, turn camel casing into dashes. So it becomes date dash picker. And this is true both for the directive name and for any arguments. So I might have an argument called delay milliseconds. That would be delay dash ms, not delay capital MS. If you try and use the other way, it's not going to come into your directive the right way. You're going to be wondering where that variable is. So how do you know if it's a good idea to use a directive? The two most common and most easy to answer questions you should ask yourself are, do I need to make something that's reusable in other parts of my application? Am I doing something that's one-off, or am I doing something that I'm going to be using in 4 or 5 or 6 different places? If you're going to be reusing it in multiple places, it's probably time to think about writing a directive. The other one is, do I need this thing to be individually testable? Because it's great to have tests, and the more things you have in one place, the harder it becomes to test those. The more chance there is of pollution or of unexpected interactions between those components. So by putting something into a directive, you can make something that is testable by itself. All right, let's play. Go ahead, if you want to follow along, you can go ahead and clone this GitHub repository. This -b step 1, there are 4 or 5 steps that we're going to start with. Step 1 will get you to the point where you've got the code checked out, you've got the application structure set up. In fact, let me just check that out myself and show you. I'm going to have to change the way I'm mirroring, so just give me a second. Is that okay? Can you guys see that okay in the back? Okay. All right. First things first. We've got a very basic, let me start at the HTML file. We have a simple body element with a books controller called books. And we've got I'm showing you the wrong step, I apologize. Let me check out step 1. All right, this is better. I've still got that same controller called books, but I don't have anything interesting in my DOM yet. I just have, hey, this is going to be a directive demo. There are a couple support files set up for you, though. If you look at the package JSON, you'll see that we've installed the Jasmine core libraries, which we'll need to use for testing, along with Karma and some tools that we'll use with Karma in order to automate the testing of it for us. If you are unfamiliar with Karma, you're going to want to become familiar with Karma as you start working with Angular. It's the recommended way of writing unit tests for your code. It will run them. You can set it up to watch your development files and your test files. As soon as anything changes, it will run those quickly either in Phantom.js or in a browser for you, and it will report those out to you on the console. It'll tell you quickly if you've broken something. But it takes a little bit of configuration, so I didn't want to spend the time during this demo showing you how to do all of that. I just wanted it to be there and working. And it's got a configuration file that says when everything's done, it's going to make Angular and the mock libraries available to us. It's going to load our application, it's going to load any spec files that we've got defined, and it's also going to load any HTML partials that we might make. That's what this preprocessor step down here is for. It says find any of these HTML files that we're including and make those available, so when something in Angular says, hey, I need template URL of X, Normally, Angular would do an XHTTP. It would do an HTTP request to load that, bring it in. Well, we don't want to do that during our tests. We just want it to be available. So this tells it to make those templates available to Angular so that it doesn't have to request them. They're just there when it needs it. And it throws those in a module called app templates. And then in our app.js file, all we have so far is a books controller that has some books defined. It doesn't do anything interesting yet. So the goal of this is going to be, we want to write a directive that prints out a books list for us. We're writing a book catalog. And there's going to be two modes for this book catalog. It's got a read-only mode and it's got an admin mode. So in admin mode, we want to be able to optionally delete the books from this list. But when you're just looking at the list as a read-only user, we don't want to have that delete option available. So there's going to be two primary goals. One, write a directive that can print me out a list of books, sorry. And number two, make that directive conditionally able to add a delete button. Let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is go into the HTML file for, oh, and I guess, no, that's this bookslist.temple, that's just because I haven't reloaded my Vim drawer. So we're going to go into the HTML file. Let's start. We're going to call this books list, or just book list. We're going to pass in books equals, we want to grab it from our books controller, which we've got defined as books, and the variable that we gave it in that controller was list. We're now going to close this custom directive. That'll match up with this. I'd like to stop here and point out just briefly this books control as books. This is what is called controller as syntax. And the reason that I'm using this syntax instead of just what you might have seen as you've looked around various demo sites, Angular 2.0 is not going to have scopes the way that we think of them now. They're going away from that more towards a pattern of controllers being the object that you expose attributes on, and those become available to the DOM. So I'm just trying to start doing things more in the future way so that I don't have as much to refactor later when that changes. So instead of it being scope.list, or just list in this case, it's books.list, books being the instance of my books control. So I've got this book list directive. Books is being passed in. I'm going to go ahead and start up a web server. There is, and all of this code is available on GitHub, as I said. Another thing that we added in the initial is npm, the package JSON knows how to start the server for us, but I probably should install the dependencies first. So while that goes, there are two commands that you can run by default when you've cloned this repository and gotten your node module set up. They are npm start and npm test. Npm start is going to just start a local web server on port 8080 with the contents of this directory. Npm test is going to start the unit tests and watch for changes. Whenever something changes, we're going to rerun those. So I've got those installed now. I should be able to npm start. I'm now serving there. Should be able to go into Chrome and open that up. Okay, we can see we've got AngularJS directive demo up in the little tiny title bar up there, but there's nothing on the screen. That's to be expected because all we've got in our DOM is a custom directive that we haven't defined. So let's do something with that. And again, my goal is not to teach you proper application structure, so I'm just going to put everything in a single file for now. So we're going to define a new directive called book list. When you're defining a directive, the directive function needs to return that directive configuration object that we showed you on the slides. So we're going to say we're going to restrict this one to elements. And we're going to give it a template URL of, what did we call it? I think it was booklist.tpl.html. Let's go and let's see. Let's create that file. Booklist.tpl.html. We're going to just say div ng repeat equals book in books. And we're going to, inside of that, say book.title. by book.author. And then let's close that out. So now we're looping over something we haven't defined, books. We also haven't accounted for the fact that we're going to be putting this using controller as syntax inside of our directive as well. When you're using controller as syntax, everything starts with some object name. So we'll just call this book. We'll call this list control. List control.books. Let's go back to our app. Let's say we're going to call this controller as list control is what we called it. I don't remember if I used camel casing or not. I did not. Let's make that all lowercase. Controller as list control. Now, remember from our index HTML file, we're passing in books as an argument essentially to this directive. We need to somehow get that onto our directives controller so it can be accessed inside of our directives template. So we've told it we want to put the controller as that. The scope things we need available to us are going to be just books. This equals sign means the name on the left is what we want to expose it as inside of our directive. So it's going to be controller.books, not controller. Whatever else they might want to call it on the outside. The equals says this is a two-way binding. Whatever they've passed in, if they update it, my version updates. If I update it, their version updates. You could put something after this if they're going to be passing it on a different parameter, for example. Say your directive is just book list equals X. Well, I can't say books in that case. I don't have an attribute called books. I just have the main directive element name called book list. So I could say, take the books value and assign it to whatever was on the books list attribute on the directive. Usually, you're probably not going to do that. You're going to try and keep things clean, keep the mappings one-to-one so it's easier to debug. And we're going to do that here. And then after we've got that set up, we're going to say bind to controller true. What this is telling it is normally this syntax would define the books object on your directive's scope object. Well, like I said, scope is going away in Angular 2. They're changing the way that works. We want it to bind to our controller instead. In Angular 1.4, you won't need to do it this way. You would just change this scope to be bind to controller, and that would do both of those pieces for you. But we're using Angular 1.3 for this demo, so we're going to do it this way. Controller as list control, scope, I want the books, bind it to the controller true. My controller has a name, it's got an element, it's got a template URL. Well, let's see what happens then. With any luck, this will start showing us something. And there's no luck. So what did I do wrong? That's always the problem when you're doing a live demo, is when you write the thing the day before. I had a different demo planned. I changed it up last night. So let's go and look at our code, our next step, and see what I did wrong. What am I missing? So I skipped a step. That's what I did. I made it harder for myself by skipping a step. So let's just check out. Let's go to the simpler version. Let's just back out what we've done and check out step 2. All right, let's go back over here again. All right, so we've got the simpler version that I originally wrote, which just has it exposed on the scope object. When we go look at our directive, we've only got 2 things defined right now, the template URL and the scope, because we haven't asked to do anything more interesting yet. This time, if it doesn't work, I'm just going to hang my head in shame. Okay, it works this time. All right, great. So we now have a functioning directive. Does it do everything we want it to do? Not yet. The next step is going to be teaching it how to delete books. So, first thing, let's go into our index file, and let's say delete equals books.delete book. And we're going to pass in whatever book object they clicked on. So here we need to define that function. This.delete book equals function that takes a book. And then we're just going to say this dot list dot splice this.list.index of book 1. So this is going to find wherever that book is and remove that one element from our array. Now nothing's going to work yet though, because all we've done is we've told our HTML template to pass that variable in, but we're not actually doing anything with it yet inside of our directive. So let's fix that. First thing to do, let's say we want to call this delete function. We're not going to use delete because you can see delete is a reserved keyword. We don't want to have any of our IDEs yelling at us because, well, you can use delete, but they don't want you to. We don't want to wrap it in strings and make it look ugly. So we're just going to call it delete function internally. And we're going to define that to the delete attribute. Now you'll notice I'm using another new kind of identifier here. And I don't need the equals. I apologize for that. So this ampersand says, this is an external function that I want you to be able to call. So basically, it allows them to pass in a function reference, which we can call. This allows our directive to talk to the outside world, to send them information, which sometimes, like for example in this case, you want to be able to do. Let's just stick with the link function for now because it's simpler and we can refactor later. So we've got our scope, our element, and our attributes. We now need to do something with those. We can say scope.canDelete equals, does the attribute do we have a delete attribute? So we're just going to do a double bang on that. And this just says, I've now got scope.canDelete, which is going to be true if they've passed in a delete parameter and false otherwise. Let's go and try and do something with that in our template for our directive. So we're going to go down here and we're going to put in a button. We're going to use ngIf to say only include this thing if canDelete is true, which we can just say if canDelete, because an uninitialized value is going to be undefined. That's false. And then we're going to say ngClick equals handle delete on this book. This book right here is the book that we have access to in the current scope of our repeat cycle. And then we're going to have the button label say delete, and we're going to end this button. So let's see if we have anything. Let's check our code really quick. We've got the delete function being passed in. We're checking if canDelete. We're not doing anything with that yet. Okay, let's go see. Look, I've got delete buttons now. And we can verify that that works as expected simply by deleting that delete parameter from our directive. You'll notice that the delete button is now gone. So we know from observing, we haven't got any formal tests around this, but we have visually verified that this portion at least is doing what we expect. If they pass in the delete parameter, we're going to give them a chance to delete that. Now, clicking that doesn't do anything yet. Let's fix that. All right, so scope, what we're calling in our template is handle delete. And I called this a different thing specifically because I don't want there to be any confusion here with what it's called on the controller and what it's called in the directive. Those are completely separate. They don't matter. They can each be called whatever they want to. This one here is talking to the directive, so we're going to use the directives function. And we actually call that handle function inside our definition for the directive. That's right here. What was that? So yeah, okay, so here, let me verify. So here we've got it called delete function, and here we've got, handle function, yeah. We'll do it this way, because we do need to, I need to wrap that value before it goes out. So we need to define handle delete on our directive scope. Scope.handle delete equals function, it takes a book. And when this happens, this is where we need to call the outside resource, the person that gave us that delete function. We need to now call their delete function with the right values. So we're going to say scope.delete function book. This is another interesting thing to note. I'm passing in an object of book to book. So the name here on the left side in your object, this is what it's going to be exposed as to the outside function. So you do need to know a little bit about the contract here. In the index.html, we can see we're expecting this to get a function called book, and we'll take it out there. So we're calling that book here. It's going to map it. When Angular parses that HTML, it looks for that variable name of book, and we're now providing that variable name of book to it. So let's see if this works. We've got the handle delete function, which calls our scopes delete function. We've got that passed in as books.deleteBook. Our controller has that function defined, so hopefully things are just going to work at this point. Let's give it a go. And they do. I can now delete books. So that's great. We've now got something that works. But we don't have much confidence in this continuing to work because we don't have any tests. Anytime we modify the directive in any way, we have to come through and run through whatever manual tests to make sure it still works. Let's automate that. So now I'm going to make a new file in my spec folder. We're going to call this booklist.spec.js. Node not created. Why is node not created? All right, because I already had one. This is one of the things that I bootstrapped for you in step 1 because, again, it just takes some time, and I didn't want to go over all that minutia, but I do want to point out what we're doing here. You can tell I used to be doing a different demo. This is the book list directive, not the autofocus directive. Before each test runs, we want to load the app templates module. As I pointed out in the karma config file, this is what is going to give us access to our book list template file. Because remember, when you define something with a template URL, Angular is going to try and go and load that at runtime unless it's been put inside of Angular's template cache. That's what Karma is doing for us, is putting that into the template cache in a module called app templates. So this is going to allow our directive to actually get its template for us to test. We're going to load the demo module because that's the module that our directive is defined inside of. And then also before each test runs, we're going to inject some mocks. This underscore syntax right here is a syntax that Angular understands that says, okay, I still want to get the $sign compile service, but I want you to give me a mock of it. We've got Angular mocks loaded, so that's going to work. But we don't want to keep calling it underscore inside of our test file, so we're just going to reassign that to this compile and root scope variable, which we've defined up here. So how do we get started with testing our directive? So let's first verify that it prints out a list of books. Should display a list of books. We need to manually construct the HTML string that we want to create. We're then going to tell Angular, compile this HTML template for us against whatever scope, and digest to see. And the digest cycle will do is say, and then go and evaluate everything. So what that could look like is var string equals, and we're going to call this book list books equals books, and that's all. Now the question is, where is it getting this books from? Well, it's not getting it from anywhere yet. Let's define that. Scope, which we define up here on line 12 as a new scope object for us to use during our tests. I'm going to say scope.books equals, and let's just keep this simple and do title A, author B. And let's do this again and call it title Y and author Z. Let's make these commas so they actually work. I've now got a complaint that, hey, I've got string, but I'm not using it. So let's now, I'm going to define, and the reason for this will become clear soon, I'm going to define an element variable out there. I'm going to say element is equal to, I want to compile that string against my scope that we've now added the books object to. So we're now saying, Angular, compile this string right here, look for any directives that it has. It's going to say, oh, I've got a books variable right here. That matches up with what's on the scope. We're good to go. And then we're going to tell it to digest that, which says, now go ahead and evaluate everything. Make sure all the bindings are now done. So at this point, we should have a done template. I actually want to get the actual element. When you do a compile, you're going to get a jQuery-like object back, which is an array where you've got your object at the first thing and then some helper functions and whatever else. I just want access to the raw element. So let's now expect if I do lm.querySelector all div length to be 2. So what we're saying is, after this is successfully compiled, I should have 2 divs inside of my book list, because that's how many books there are. Let's now go ahead and run this. A typo? Oh no, where's my typo? What's the typo?
I'm sorry.
Okay. We can see our tests. The test passed, so if there's it likes it, so I'm okay with it. Great, we've got a passing test. So we now know that we at least have the right number of elements. Let's see if they look the right way. Well, now we want to do a different test, because good testing philosophy is try and have one thing that you test per each spec, and it per specification. And that's basically what your it block is this is the behavior that you want to test, this is the thing that you want to look at. So we've already done something in this first block. We've tested the length. Now we want to verify that we have the right structure. Should display title, author. Now we have a problem here. We have to do all this work again, and that's just a pain. So we're going to write a little helper function. Function compile, and we'll do that later. We're going to take this and move that up there. We're going to move this bit up there too. So now all I have to do down here is say compile after I've set up my scope, and it will do the rest of it for us. I also don't want to do this bit again, so I'm going to move this up into my before each. So before every test, I'm going to have some books defined. Our test should still be passing. We haven't really done anything yet, but we haven't broken anything, and that's the important thing to know right now. So let's compile it, and then let's expect lm.querySelector all div. Let's grab the first one, and then let's grab the text content to equal, and this one should be a comma by b. Oh no, we failed. Why? Because we've got all this extra white space inside of our template between the closing tag and where we actually put in the binding expressions. So let's make a little helper for that. Function get text. We'll pass in an element, and it will return element.textContent.trim. Yes, I'm going to assume that you're using a JavaScript environment that knows what the trim command is. So we're going to say expect get text on that to be a comma b. Unexpected token. Now I've actually got an error somewhere. All right, I was missing that. Some of your tests did a full page reload. That's because I saved too fast. Okay, our tests are now passing again. We now have tests that show that we've got the right number of directives, the right number of books, and that they have the right structure. Now let's test our delete button. So the first thing is it should not have a delete button by default. So let's compile it again, and let's say expect get lm.querySelector all for buttons length to be 0. Do we have no buttons? We have no buttons. Great. Well, now let's verify that it works when we do want the buttons. So now we're going to describe. We're going to do a nested describe because we want to do some common setup configuration without affecting the previous tests. So I'm going to say if delete is specified. We're going to put another before each block in here. And we're going to say, we're going to have it compile for us. And we're going to pass in delete true. Let's deal with that. Can delete. Actually, let's do this a different way so that our compile function doesn't need to know as much about how we want to write our tests. So let's say this has a delete handler. All right. We're going to say if delete handler string plus equals delete equals, and then let's put in whatever string they give us for delete handler. Okay. Oh, yes, thank you. And then we're going to do string plus suffix. I've still got something wrong here. Oh, there's the problem. The problem is that I'm missing a single quote there. All right. Our tests are still working. You'll sometimes see that some of your tests did a full page reload. If you save multiple times in a row, which I sometimes do inside Vim because I get panicky, it'll say, oh, this is a red flag. If you're doing a reload, then you need to rethink that. That's not actually happening here. So we're going to say compile, and we're going to pass in my_delete function. That doesn't actually exist right now, though, so let's define that. Scope.myDelete function. And we're going to use a Jasmine spy for this, because we don't actually want to test our controller's behavior. We just want to verify that we call this function. So by creating a spy, this gives us something that we can then say, hey, were you called? Were you called with these arguments? So we've now got scope.myDelete function. I apologize. I guess we're out of time. So if you want to stick around, I'm going to continue until we get through with this. But in respect for those of you who do need to leave, I'd like to stop now and take any questions that people have.
Are your slides available somewhere?
Yes, they are. The link, let me show that really quickly. It'll come across faster if I don't try and say it.
If you look up the talk on joined.in, I'll make sure that he...
They are there. They're linked on joined in.
Okay.
So if you go to that joined in link, either of those links will take you to joined in, and the slides are linked from there. Or just remove the feedback portion, and the slides are there. All right, is anybody interested in me finishing up that demo? All right, let's keep going. So,
Last talk anyway.
That's right, nobody has anywhere to go except home, right?
If we go home, we'll have to do chores.
Dinner can wait. All right, so I've got my delete function specified. I've told that to compile. I should now be able to write a test that expects the button to be there. It should have delete buttons. Expect lm.query selector all button length to be 2. That worked. We've now got 4 passing tests. Now, the last thing that we need to test is, if we click that delete button, does it do what we expect it to do? Which in this case is just, does it call my handler with the book function, with the book value? So it should call the external handler when delete is clicked. We're going to lm.query selector all button. We're going to get the first one, and then we're going to click it. Then, in order to know if that did what we expect, we're going to say expect scope.myDelete function to have been called. And I'm missing an N. Let's go see. Nope, expected spy unknown to have been called. So let's see if I did anything funny here. Yep. Up here, we didn't really define this handler correctly. It just says delete equals the function name. We didn't actually evaluate it. So we're going to say book. We're now trying to invoke that thing. And now, sure enough, our test passes. So we know that it's calling it, but is it calling it with the right object? That's our last test that we need to write.
So your test caught a bug.
My test caught a bug, which is a great thing about tests. And it's one of the great things about writing your tests first, because then it verifies that you don't write code that you don't need, because if I had never encountered it, I would have written extra code. Okay, so now should pass the correct book for the click handler, for the delete button. And on this one, we're going to click the second button just for fun. We're going to do lm.query selector all, button 0, click it, and then expect scope. Actually, shorthand. Expect scope.myDelete function to have been called with, and this is going to be scope.books1. Because we're clicking on the 1th element, we should be getting called with YZ. Sure enough, we are. All of our tests pass. We now have a directive that we know prints out the list of books. We know that it prints them out in the right order, at least partially, because the first one was the first one. We could do other tests to verify that more comprehensively. We know that it gives us a delete button if we want it, and that the delete button does what we expect it to do. Now we can modify this directive to our heart's content and have pretty good confidence, because if we break it, our tests are going to yell at us loud and clear. All this code is available on GitHub in individual steps, so you can start out and build it yourself. You can take a look at the final product and work backwards if you want to. It's all there, and that is linked in the slides. If you go and look at the slides, again, that URL is there to that GitHub link. So thanks for sticking around. Hope you had a good time.